Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each week to update us on all the latest events in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on the current situation in Israel for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. This week, a couple of days ago really, we commemorated what in Jewish tradition is called the Shloshim, meaning the 30, which is 30 days since the massacre on October 7th, what some people are calling the Black Sabbath, or some people are calling the pogrom, etc. And 30 days has a significance. It's when graves are put up here in Israel, according to the Jewish tradition. It's a day, the end of one of the periods of mourning. So there's quite a lot of looking back and remembering this week. And as I've said many, many times, not just here, but to individuals that I've spoken to, Israel is still very much stuck on October 7th. It's still rehashing what happened, the stories of massacre, the stories of kidnapping, the families. That's still very much, while much of the world has moved on and is focusing maybe on what's happening in Gaza and elsewhere in the world and local news, whatever that may be, Israel is still very much stuck in the trauma and shock of October 7th. But we've had some interesting developments in the last 24 hours, let's say, two very important developments, and where Israel, or the Israeli government, the Israeli decision-making infrastructure does on these particular issues is going to be very important. How it proceeds with the war against Hamas. First of all, the big question tonight is Israel going to agree to a ceasefire, or, as it's being sort of touted in Israel and by its allies, a humanitarian pause? One can imagine that the idea of a ceasefire, especially after Israeli leaders promised the people there will be no ceasefire, the goals of this war that Israel did not start nor seek are twofold, I should say. To destroy Hamas, or at least destroy its rule in Gaza, and to return the 239 hostages abducted by Hamas on October 7th. And Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Chief of Staff and the Defense Minister, etc., have all promised that there'll be no ceasefire, there'll be no let up until those goals have been achieved. So it comes as a bit of a problem that there's many calls around the world for a ceasefire. President Biden was asked about this today, and in a sort of throwaway comment as he was leaving an event, he said, it's something that I've asked the Israeli Prime Minister yesterday, but I still haven't heard back from him. We also heard Secretary of State Blinken, who is in Japan for the G7, also relate to this and said there will be no ceasefire because a ceasefire is only good for Hamas. That's something which Israel has been pushing, that it's clear Hamas want a ceasefire, not because of humanitarian reasons, but because they are taking quite a battering, which I'll get to in a minute. So he again referred to something akin to a humanitarian pause, and that's what not only Prime Minister Netanyahu has talked about, but also the spokesperson of the IDF, which gives a briefing every night around 8:15, 8:20 on the main news. So the question is how long it will last, what it means. Also, I should note at the G7, they put out a very interesting communique at the end of it, again, not mentioning the word ceasefire. So it seems in the international arena, at least, with the US and Israel's close partners in the West, the G7, is the wealthiest countries in the world, are not calling for a ceasefire. But there is pressure on Israel, clearly, for something like a humanitarian pause. Now, what that would look like is anybody's guess at this point. What Israel has been doing, at least for the last few days, is allowing humanitarian corridor. I believe something like between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. every day to allow the people in the north, where the majority of the fighting, well, pretty much the only fighting is taking place, to get to the south where there's no fighting and Israel is not bombing or attacking. And today and yesterday, around 50,000 took advantage of that. It's significant that 50,000 did it because it means that, as of today at least, there are a lot of Gazans, and we'll see if it also happens tomorrow, are now more scared of what the IDF is doing than Hamas. Before that, the reason they didn't leave is because Hamas threatened them. Hamas threatened that if they left their houses, they left their homes, they would be shot, their family members would be shot, etc. So they were too scared to leave. Now they've got to a point where they're no longer scared of Hamas, which again is a bit of an embarrassment for Hamas. They try very hard not to show the images and pictures of Palestinians leaving, many with white flags in their arms, walking on the main thoroughfare that stretches from north to south in Gaza, while the Israeli defense forces looked on and even protected them from Hamas, who were trying to even attack these internally displaced as they tried to go south. The reason that it seems that there's great emphasis on a ceasefire, and tonight at least, we got these rumors again, which we've had in the past, that Hamas are seeking a ceasefire in exchange for 10 to 15 hostages. Now, it's significant as well because it shows that Hamas, in the past, they wanted their prisoners, what they call their prisoners, or Israel's prisoners, which are actually, mass murdering terrorists. They wanted them to be released for hostages. Then they wanted fuel. Now, the most important commodity is time. Hamas need time. They are, as I said, they're taking a battering. The lower levels of terrorists, who they basically, the Hamas leadership, while they live underground, they've left the lower levels and the medium levels up to try and fight the IDF. The IDF has made tremendous gains, claiming it has killed between 2, 3, and maybe even 4,000 terrorists. It hasn't taken out yet any of the top level Hamas leaders yet, because, as we know, they are deep underground in these bunkers, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But the ones who are sort of active in command in the field, many of those have been taken out. And what Israel assesses tonight is that the leadership, which is underground, the devs, the Sinwars of this world, are very much disconnected from what's going on, disconnected from their leadership, who is living luxurious lives like Ismail Haniyeh and people like that, multi-billionaires living in Qatar, living in Iran and places like that. They are very disconnected from them. They're disconnected from each other and very much disconnected from the command center. So the Israeli war effort against Hamas is going well. They have been severely disrupted. Israel has managed to take out quite a large amount of their terrorist infrastructure. I think 700 RPGs they talked about today as well. And Hamas are clearly feeling the heat, and that's why they're calling for a ceasefire, or at least a 1 or 2 day pause in Israel's offensive, and they've promised to release 10 to 15. Again, these are just rumors. Israel is saying do not be taken in by these. There are reports from Egypt, there are reports from Qatar, so it's clear that something is happening. This offer seems to be out there, whether it's serious, whether it's coming from the center of Hamas, whether it's coming from the Hamas leadership abroad, we do not know. And also, who exactly are these 10 to 15? Will they be foreign workers like Thai workers? Will they be dual citizens? Will they be children? These are all questions that are being asked today. Netanyahu has sort of equivocated a little bit in the English language media. He's talked about he would be willing for some sort of humanitarian pause for the release of hostages, whereas in Hebrew he said there'll be no ceasefire until all the hostages. So there's a little bit of difference in there, a little bit of wiggle room for him. We'll have to wait and see if there is something serious behind this offer, whether there is an opportunity to receive 10 to 15 of the hostages for again, something which Hamas needs very much. There are certain concerns, obviously, in Israel that allowing Hamas a 1 or 2 day pause in hostilities would allow them to rearm, would allow them to move around, would allow them to get out of Israel's sort of scope, etc., etc. So there are differences of opinion whether this would help. What is clear, though, is that there is great pressure on Israel to take some time out. Perhaps that's where the hostages have been dangled a little bit, but there is a feeling that they need it also for this whole issue of international legitimacy. So we'll see what happens. Israel's offensive, as I said, is going pretty well. They are now within Gaza City, places that they haven't been since, the early 2000s. And they are making great gains. They seem to be moving towards the major centers of the Hamas command infrastructure, which, as we know, are below the major hospitals, especially the Shifa hospital. What's interesting tonight is Israel did quite a lot of preemptive PR in that respect, releasing footage of the terrorists that were captured on October 7th, explaining that Hamas uses hospitals because they know, as in the words of the terrorists, the Jews don't bomb hospitals, and that they are able to move around freely in the Gaza Strip because they use and utilize ambulances. And again, they say, we know that Jews don't bomb ambulances. So what's clear is for many, many years, Hamas have built up their command infrastructure, utilizing not just hospitals, schools, and even UNRWA institutions. And this is being proven not just by the testimony of captured terrorists, but also Israel has put out some in-depth information about the fact that they've been shot at from children's playgrounds, from schools, from UNRWA facilities, and of course from hospitals. But it's clear that the next aim of the Israeli offensive is the tunnel system. And as we know, the major tunnel systems are under the hospitals, even though Israel has reportedly discovered 130 tunnels tunnel openings, I should say, thus far. Another important moment was on Friday. We heard Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah speak for the first time. We know Hassan Nasrallah likes to go on. His speech was at least an hour, but it was much anticipated exactly what he would say. Some were suggesting that maybe he would declare war on Israel. In the end, it was actually very interesting because he really went the opposite direction of declaring war, saying that he was not involved in October 7th. He didn't know about it. He doesn't know what Hamas are doing even now. But he did try, at least for his own street, to try and say, well, we're doing our bit by distracting the Israeli army. We have, half of its army need to be in the north because of what we're doing. So because of that, there's less pressure on Gaza. Basically, reading between the lines, he's not really doing much. And Hamas and the anti-Israel forces in the region were severely let down, and they felt let down because he really said at this point he's not going to go any further. That's reading between the lines. That's not to say he may not in the future. There was this big suggestion that maybe if Israel gets bogged down in Gaza, but there's now, according to some experts, Israel is doing so well in Gaza and making such good progress that actually Nasrallah's wiggle room is really shrinking as we speak, because if Israel is able to really land a deadly blow to Hamas in the next week or so, then it really will be able to re-engage all its forces in the north, and that will be far more troublesome for Hezbollah. Another thing related to Hezbollah that was released in the last hour is Hezbollah did try did plan and was about to execute a terrorist attack on Jewish locations in Brazil. Apparently, it was a combination of Brazil's local intelligence and police forces, and the Mossad were able to stifle that. But what it's clear is that Iranian proxies are trying to target Jewish sites around the world, and this is probably the first, perhaps, of many. Unfortunately, again, we have to talk politics. Another big event that took place this week is what exactly is happening with the coalition's funds. Is the government doing enough to help those couple of 100,000 Israelis who've been evacuated and are forced to live in hotels, to live in guest houses, to live in all sorts of very difficult conditions for months? and the amount of money that's been given to businesses that have been closed down, and the war effort and everything that goes towards that. This week, apparently, we've explained this before, but there's something called coalition funds. Every party that enters the coalition, not only do they ask for funds for various projects, but there's also a sort of slush fund that each one are given for extra sort of curricula, let's say, or not off the books, because they are on the books, but they're not necessarily notarized for anything specifically. And the most obviously controversial one are for the ultra-Orthodox parties, where there are hundreds of millions, if not billions, of shekels, which are badly needed at this point, which the ultra-Orthodox parties want to go to unregistered school systems, unregistered because they refuse to teach basic subjects like math, like English, like grammar, and so they can't be recognized. But under this coalition agreement, they were to be given this money to basically pay for these schools. That, as one can imagine, is very controversial at this point. There was an attempt to move a few hundred million across to these schools at this point. Reportedly, Benny Gantz threatened to quit if this happened, because Benny Gantz, as we know, entered this emergency government on the proviso that nothing would be done that wasn't relevant to the war effort. There were then sort of trades of accusations exactly who's doing this in the Economic Committee, in the Finance Committee, I should say, in the Knesset this week. Gaffney of the ultra-Orthodox United Torah Judaism Party said that as far as he's concerned, the money can go towards the war effort, but he was told by Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich not to put it. Bezalel Smotrich claimed that that's not true either. So there's a bit of a blame game. The fact is that while they did over hundreds of millions of shekels, even billions of shekels that can be desperately needed for so many things in the war effort, it's clear that something problematic is going on. There is still petty politics, and there is still the blame game, and it's just creating a bad atmosphere for those who have already lost a certain amount of faith in the government, especially those who have lost their homes, who have lost jobs, etc., etc. So unfortunately, politics goes on, but the war carries on, reportedly in a good way at this point. So I'm happy to answer any questions on these or any other issues.
Thank you so much for that update. We have quite a few questions coming in. The first one from Eric Selkov asking, are there a large number of Hamas leaders moving to southern Gaza or in countries outside of Gaza? With that being the case, how can Israel ever declare this war a victory if they're escaping?
Well, the leaders outside of Israel are seen as legitimate targets. There are some in Lebanon, Turkey, Qatar, Iran, and other places, and they have been seen as legitimate targets. Various political and defense officials have said that they are dead men walking and sort of threats like that. But the major ones on the ground in Gaza, Deif and Sinwar and people like that, there is confidence. There appears to be confidence that they will eventually be killed or arrested. Unlikely that they'll be arrested. I don't think they'll come quietly. It is felt that they are in their bunkers. They're not able to come up and move around. Israel is trying to make sure as much as possible that those who are moving to the south are not Hamas officials. And leaving the Strip is very difficult at this point, because one can imagine, between Israel's restrictions and Egypt's restrictions, very, very few people are leaving. There have been some who have left for field hospitals just over the border, and some dual citizens, but they are checked rigorously. So at the moment, there's very high confidence that none of these leaders in the Gaza Strip have left yet.
Thank you. We have a few questions coming in about what is the plan for Gaza once Hamas is defeated? Will Israel stay there for the foreseeable future? Are they looking to occupy Gaza again or expel the Gazans? What will this look like afterwards?
Well, that was also raised in the last week. There is no definitive plan, or at least not one that's been released by Israel. There are a few things that have been worked on behind the scenes, some different options, looking at all the different options and giving it some sort of rating from bad to worse, because there are no great options. Let's be clear about that. Netanyahu has come out and said that Israel needs to have some sort of security assurances, and Israel will need to play a very strong role in securing its own borders. So it will need to be there in some respect. It has been no one in Israel really seriously at the highest level is talking about reoccupying and reforming Gush Katif, the Israeli communities that were there before the disengagement of 2005. There was one or two from the more extreme right-wing parties, but they're just sort of sounding out. They don't really have any decision-making abilities. What the Americans have been very clear about is that Israel will not be there in the long term. But as Kirby, the spokesperson for the National Security Council, the U.S. National Security Council, said that they can envision Israel's presence there for an interim period. How long that is, at what level Israel will be there, that obviously, as he said, is to be determined based on the results of the war. But Israel doesn't really want to be there. The options are maybe the PA, which is something that the Americans and some in the West want. Israel doesn't see that as a good solution. Abu Mazen himself hasn't even expressed any great interest in doing that either. So it's unclear exactly how that would stand. I did hear Victor Lieberman, the leader of the Israel Beitenu party, say this week that he believes that the Arab League should play a very senior role in that. But that begs the question, what would happen if Israel needed to respond in the future to attacks, with Egyptian, Saudi, Emirati, Qatari officials, or even military there? Would Israel have a free hand? So there are no great solutions. But it doesn't seem that anyone has got a firm answer at this point what's going to be the day after, because, again, a lot of it depends on the results of the war and exactly how far Israel is able to go. But I think that's something which is being kept under wraps for now.
Thank you. Len Getz asked, does a pause mean from airstrikes only or also ground attacks on terrorists and tunnels?
I believe it would be totally a military pause. There would be no attacks on the ground or from the air or from the sea.
Understood. Thank you. So D. Engels asks, how would the Israeli public react to a humanitarian pause to get a few rather than all of the hostages? And Reuven Hawk follows up, has there been any discussion before any humanitarian pause to allow the Red Cross to visit all the hostages to see how their welfare is?
Well, I'll address that last point. It's not a matter of allowing the Red Cross to visit the hostages. The Red Cross has claimed, at least, that it's not able to, that they're being ignored, that they are not even able to get, don't forget, Israel has no confirmation on how many of the 239 hostages are alive, who has them, what status they're in. There have been noises every now and again, Hamas saying that some of them have already been killed. They are obviously trying to blame Israel, say that they've been killed in the strikes, but it's extremely likely that some of them were killed. Some of them were in bad shape. We know one, for example, lost his arm as he was taken and probably did not receive sufficient, medical care. So it wouldn't be surprising if all 239 were not alive, but we simply just don't know. The Red Cross has not been able to visit. They claim that they're trying. They claim that they're trying to speak to Hamas, but simply Hamas have no interest in giving us Israel anything or the outside world. So that's to do with that question. As far as the humanitarian pause in Israeli society, it's hard to gauge. If there would be something like the release of some hostages, I think that it would be understood. If it was for nothing, that would be harder to explain. There are differences of opinions whether it would hurt Israel's advances, because obviously that would give Hamas leaders and its fighting command, a couple of days to regroup, and that obviously could cost Israeli lives when it restarts the military advances. And because it's doing so well on the military front, the fact that Hamas are demanding a ceasefire, again, let me be clear, Hamas is not demanding a ceasefire because of any humanitarian needs. They've said it many times themselves. They only need it because they are taking such a battering. So the question is, when Israel is in the ascendancy, whether it would be a good idea. And it seems to be that most military experts seem to say that it would be a mistake. But as the spokesperson for the IDF said, that, sort of hinted that it could help us in the long term because of the international legitimacy for the war. There is a lot of heat, there is a lot of pressure. The images that are coming out of Gaza for the innocent Gazans that are suffering are harsh and are very real, and obviously affect global opinion at the public level, but also at the political level. And it is felt that allowing a humanitarian pause, trying as much as possible to allow the civilians of Gaza to gain from it and not Hamas, would obviously be what Israel would want to do, but that's obviously not what Hamas would want to take advantage. It's quite clearly has no interest in the people. In fact, has called on people to surround the Shifa hospital, putting them in danger. And that's also something which they can try and gain from this humanitarian pause. So it's unclear. Certainly, if there was a ceasefire, that would be something extremely negatively seen in Israel. People would certainly not accept that. But perhaps a short pause, if there was some gain, perhaps in hostages, probably that's the key that would be most acceptable, I think, for most Israelis at this point. Anything else would just be not clearly understood why Israel would be doing it.
Thank you. So one more question on the hostages there. Edward Lipson asks, has there been any public discussion about the tension between destroying tunnels and rooting out Hamas leaders versus protecting or rescuing hostages, presumably also in the tunnels?
There has been, and it is a debate. It's interesting because there was this big debate amongst, former security officials, and then they interviewed the mother of two young teenagers who had been kidnapped, and she basically shouted at the people on TV and said, "You're having this debate whether you should take take out the tunnels from above, whether you should take them out from below, but my children are probably in these tunnels, so it's unfair that you're doing this." It's a question, it's a quandary I certainly am glad I don't have to deal with. It's a very difficult question, because undoubtedly many, if not all, of the abducted hostages are probably deep underground, exactly where the Hamas leaders are, exactly where Israel needs to get to finish this war, to destroy Hamas. It's a very difficult question. It is one that's really breaking the Israeli people in many ways. And obviously it's a very emotive subject. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if I'm sure our leaders have discussed this. And probably that's why they'll take, if there are any hostages to be released, they'll take whatever they can at this point. But it's an impossible question, certainly one that I'm not in a place to answer, and I thank God that I'm not.
Absolutely. Thank you. Ken Moskowitz asks, what does defeat of Hamas mean? Kill all terrorists? Hamas is an ideological, theological, ideology, theology. How do you defeat a theology?
Well, we've seen, ideological extremist, Islamist terrorist groups defeated in recent times. ISIS was defeated. Al-Qaeda is pretty much been defeated. Does that mean that there's never ever going to be an attack anywhere in the world where people will claim that they're members of ISIS or Al-Qaeda? No, but clearly they are not what they were. Hamas is a little bit different. They do govern even today. maybe hopefully not for much longer, they do govern a territory, and they threaten from that territory a state next to them. So, Israel has talked about destroying Hamas rule in Gaza rather than Hamas, because as the questioner rightly says, Hamas is not just the government in Gaza. It is an organization, it is an ideology, but certainly if they were able to defeat Hamas, get rid of Hamas's rule in the Gaza Strip, that would probably achieve one of the main goals of this particular offensive. But again, there are pockets of Hamas outside of Gaza, but those are really the sort of leaders who live in luxury and in their mansions in Qatar or Turkey or wherever it may be, which obviously are far more difficult to get to. But it does seem that Israel is on the path for destroying Hamas rule. It seems that at the moment it's certainly not able to rule, but it's clearly not at the end of this offensive yet. But when a movement or an organization rules a territory, then it is possible to remove them from that rule, and that would be considered, I believe, to have achieved one of the goals of this particular offensive.
Thank you so much. So we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you for taking time to update us again this week. For our viewers and listeners, please note there will be no webinar this Friday, November 10th. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.